On July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission landed humans on the moon for the first time. Now, when you think of the Apollo space program, what comes to mind? For some of you, you might have personal memories of that moment, gathering around the television or listening to the radio to follow the journey of the astronauts, or watching those tense flight engineers in mission control as they let loose with jubilation at the completion of a successful mission. For those of us born after that moment, perhaps we think more clearly of the TV shows and movies that have dramatized this event. Things like The Right Stuff or Apollo 13, or more recently, that excellent TV show series For All Mankind. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. Or Hidden Figures, about the unacknowledged work of black women who were mathematicians at NASA in the 1950s and 60s. Perhaps we think of the iconic images that go along with that mission, Earthrise, that first color photograph of the Earth taken from space that changed our view of how we see things. Perhaps you remember that picture of Buzz Aldrin in his spacesuit standing by the American flag on the lunar surface. Now, as someone who very much wanted to be an astronaut for many years of my young life, I spent a lot of time imagining what it would be like to have been part of the Apollo program. But what I never imagined until just a few weeks ago was a group of Diné Navajo women. Diné is the name for the people, the Navajo people that they use, in Shiprock, New Mexico, peering into microscopes and creating by hand the integrated circuits, the microchips that would be critical to the Apollo guidance computers. And so here is a picture of the women at work doing tiny, tiny, intricate, detailed construction of these chips that are the size of your fingertip. So this morning, I want to dive a little deeper into this story because there is always so much more to any story than we know at first. I want to dive deeper into this story as we consider the intersection of skill and wisdom and art and the acceleration of technology that is flinging us not only into space, but into a very much unknown future. So let's start here. In 1965, when Fairchild Semiconductor opened a plant on the Navajo Reservation in Shiprock, New Mexico. Fairchild was one of the first Silicon Valley companies to start what we now know of as offshoring, that is, building manufacturing plants in other countries in an effort to find cheaper labor. But they were also looking for opportunities closer to home, and the US government was offering subsidies and tax incentives to companies that would build on the reservation. And this was also combined with low-cost labor from workers who were pretty much a captive audience. They had nowhere else to go. And with no minimum wage laws and fewer labor regulations than you might find in other locations. So Fairchild worked out a deal with the Navajo Tribal Council, and after starting with just a few dozen workers, soon over 1,000 people, almost entirely Diné and almost entirely women, were building semiconductors in Shiprock. Other tech companies like Intel would soon follow, but Fairchild was one of the first. Digital media scholar Lisa Nakamura explains the work was performed using a microscope and required painstaking attention to detail, excellent eyesight, high standards of quality, and intense focus. In 1969, Fairchild produced a promotional brochure about the plant, highlighting the similarity between the intricate pattern of the wires on a microchip and the intricate patterns woven by Diné women for generations. This is the image they used in their brochure. There's the microchip die, right, what they would use for the microchip, and there's an example of Navajo weaving. The brochure from this Silicon Valley tech company also included the text of a Navajo prayer on the back and photos of Diné women at the loom. This is unusual for tech companies to produce brochures with prayers on them at the time. Weaving in the Navajo tradition was women's work. Weaving is a deeply important part of Navajo culture. One of the core figures in the origin stories of the Diné is Spider Woman, who wove the pattern of the universe, who protected the Diné people when they emerged into this world, who taught them the gift of weaving and how to live with beauty and balance. I learned about Spider Woman on one of our several service trips to the Navajo and Hopi reservations, and we have a group that is getting ready to return to Navajo and Hopi at the end of next month, and you'll be hearing a little bit more about it next week. But on one of the few past trips, we had the opportunity to visit Canyon de Chelly, where Spider Rock towers almost 800 feet straight up out of the canyon floor. This is a deeply sacred site. There is an overlook, but visitors can only travel into the canyon with a native guide. Standing at the overlook, taking in this vista, our Diné friend Winnie Henry, who is herself an accomplished weaver, shared with us how Spider Woman was said to make her home up at the top and use the two rock towers as her loom, right? You can see the gap in the middle there. Weavers like Winnie would visit Spider Rock to ask for her blessing and inspiration, since Spider Woman was the one, the stories say, who first taught the sacred songs and practices of weaving. Now, Spider Woman had a dangerous side, too. It was also said that she would catch disobedient children in a web that she would string across the canyon and carry them up to the top of her tower and devour them if they wouldn't behave. She was a powerful protector of the people, but you did not want to be on her bad side. So weaving for the Diné is not just a pragmatic skill, but a respected art tied to the very origin stories of their people and their way of life. Diné weavers hold complex patterns and processes in their heads as they create their craft by memory. It can take many months and hundreds of hours to complete one blanket or rug, which includes dyeing and spinning the yarn as well as the weaving itself. And over the generations, it has become a reliable source of income for women and their communities. So, when Fairchild connected the work of building microchips to the skill of weaving, it did something else. It also connected that work to women's work. However, in the corporate American structure of the time, and perhaps still today, identifying something as women's work means that you can pay less for its labor. It created this thread that allowed for easy exploitation in a different system. Dr. Nakamura, in her paper, Indigenous Circuits, Navajo Women and the Racialization of Early Electronic Manufacture, points out that the Fairchild Company, rather than recognizing the education and skill that each woman brought to her work at the plant, instead, they played off of racial and gender stereotypes that made it seem like it was just natural aptitude, inborn in the women themselves, with a disposition towards compliance and attention to detail that made them good candidates for these jobs, rather than recognizing their learned experience. And the reason they were doing this work was because of the necessity of making a living. It made the women successful, and successful they were. The Shiprock plant had a less than 5% failure rate for what they made there, which was much lower than about the 20% failure rate that was being produced in other plants. They received awards for their innovative practices, and yet, 10 years after it opened, the plant was closed. In 1975, in response to layoffs and concerns about the poor health care provided on the reservations, as well as a growing push towards the possibility of unionization, because these plants were not unionized, members of the American Indian movement occupied the plant for a week, demanding that changes be made. And despite a peaceful resolution to the occupation, Fairchild closed the plant and transferred production to Southeast Asia. As with any story, there are many perspectives. Was the Fairchild plant good for the economy on the reservation, or was it exploitive? Were the people working in Shiprock better off because of the plant, or did it disrupt their previous way of living, only to abandon them a few years later? and whose voices are represented in the telling of this history. In all of the articles I read about this, it is difficult to find anything from the Native workers themselves outside of what is printed in promotional brochures by the company. But one thing is sure, and it's that the contributions of these women and women like them in many places who worked on creating those core components of the technologies that took us to the moon, that work has long been unrecognized for the skill that it was. Which brings me to a second thread in this story. And that the only reason I knew about any of this, the only reason I discovered any of this story was because of a piece of art. Or rather, two pieces of art. The first is titled Moon Landing. It is a collaborative piece between a textile artist and a composer, both of them British, created in response when they learned about these Diné women and their impact on the technology that took us to the moon. So composer Helen Caddick created a score, a musical score, using all stringed instruments, of course. And artist Margot Selby, a textile artist, she then wove a 16-meter-long tapestry to accompany the score. And you can see the tapestry hanging there, stories and stories tall. And if you go to the next photo, you can see the tapestry hanging where it was installed in this giant staircase, and there's the chamber group playing the music piece down below. The music and the tapestry combine references to microchips and computing systems, as well as spaceflight and traditional Navajo hoop dance rhythms. It was seeing photos of this tapestry on a science website that I happened to be reading that led me to discover the story of the women in Shiprock. And the second piece of art is by the fourth-generation Navajo weaver Mary Lou Schultz, the woman whose words I read earlier. Schultz has turned the tables by making weavings based off of microchip designs. So this is a weaving that Schultz created, and it is based off of an Intel microchip. This was a commission. It started with this commission from Intel, and she has gone on to continue to experiment with technical patterns in her weaving in recognition of all of the Native workers in the tech industry. So you can see here's the die for the microchip, the actual microchip on this side, and the weaving on the other side. It is an almost exact replica. And in fact, the scientist who wrote the article about this identified the various spots on the chip that do various things and could map them onto the weaving itself. Her textiles were featured last year in an exhibition at MoMA. She is currently working on a piece based on the Fairchild 9040 chip, the one that was shown in the brochure, and here you can see it in process, right? That 9040 chip that is on the cover of the Order of Service and that I showed you earlier. There's a tendency sometimes by those outside of a culture to imagine that traditional means frozen in time. But as Schultz said, as the generations move on, you're going to see that we're weaving where we're at in time. Using traditional skills and interpreting them in new ways has been the process of artists throughout human history, and Native artists like Schultz are no exception. As we return next month to visit the Navajo Nation, bringing food and supplies to support elders, doing simple repair tasks, visiting with the artists that are carrying forward their traditional practices, I will be looking at those weavings with a different perspective now. And looking forward, I can't help but wonder what kind of tapestry we are weaving for our shared future. So why tell this story, aside from my own personal interest in the Apollo missions, aside from it being kind of a curious story about humanity? What do we learn from examining these complex, interwoven relationships as we look forward at the new technologies that are going to be shaping our lives? Because in this moment, like that moment during the space race that brought us beyond the confines of our atmosphere for the first time, we are living now in a moment where new technologies are emerging that might dramatically reshape the way we perceive the world and maybe even ourselves. And in this rush forward, we need to take time to anchor ourselves in the values and principles that serve as our internal guidance systems. We are a faith tradition that embraces science and discovery while honoring the wisdom of human experience and the sacred stories that we carry, as well as being a faith tradition that honors the need to repair and heal from harm when exploitation and the search for profit have overtaken human kindness and care. So reflecting on this story, there are four main things that I take from it. One, we will always need a diversity of perspective and experience in the room if we want to accomplish great things. It is never a solitary genius or a single thread of a single culture that moves us into new horizons. We may remember the names of the astronauts or the billionaires or the political leaders who put their names on buildings, but there are always more stories than we know of working behind the scenes, often without fair recognition as the collaborators that they are. And despite our fondness for Superman stories, no one person is born to save the world. We save each other when we work together in a network of diverse perspectives, reflecting each other's beauty and strength back into the system as a whole. Two, we need to hold on to the wisdom of our humanity, even as we explore new technology that pushes us beyond what we have experienced in the past. The stories, songs, teachings, and practices developed over thousands and thousands of years help ground us in the lived, embodied reality of our lives. I'm losing my voice here a little bit. One of the academic works that influenced Dr. Nakamura's analysis is a book called Cyborg Manifesto. I came across it when I was in seminary, and I was immediately intrigued. And it's a work of feminist futurism that reminds us that nothing we do exists purely in mind space, but always in the interaction of our actual bodies with the technology we create. No matter how much we augment our reality, our human bodies and histories are part of the story, and we have to carry them with us into the future together. The third thing I took from this is that artists are necessary. They help us see connections that would otherwise get lost in the noise and the slop. They help us gain perspective outside of systems of profit and production. And one of the things that I have learned from spending time on the Hopi and Navajo reservations with Hopi and Diné people is that everyone is an artist. Almost everyone in those communities makes art of one kind or another. Everyone has the capacity to make something beautiful. And beauty and utility can go hand in hand. This line between craft and art, between what gets used every day and what gets put in a museum, this is an artificial distinction. Art can make our lives beautiful every day, and we are artists that can do that together. In the coming years, perhaps our work here together will be to find what exists uncaptured by that algorithm and explore how it shows up even in our everyday lives in the most unexpected places, keeping us in touch with that artistic spirit that shows us how to live and thrive, not just survive. And finally, the fourth thing I take from this story is that we have to keep doing the work of learning how to be non-exploitive in our relationships going forward. We have to learn how to be non-exploitive in our relationship with the earth going forward. We have to study our histories, what went well and what didn't. We have to study movements of resistance from people who refuse to be used up and discarded. We have to learn ways of living that do not require us to leave this planet to survive. Taking down plaques and rewriting history textbook does not erase what happened in the past, it only buries it. And we cannot give up on that project of excavating and re-examining things that we thought we knew, because wisdom lies there. Now, this is not an anti-science perspective. This is not a rejection of technology out of hand or a desire to return to some imaginary pre-technological past. What artists like Schultz remind us is that every generation and every culture reflects the moment in which they live. And even the most traditional of practices incorporates those interconnected relationships and new technologies that shape us. Perhaps our work together as Unitarian Universalists, as a faith that rejects the idea of placing religion and science at opposite ends of the spectrum and insists that they can coexist, perhaps our work will be to be traditional in the most modern possible way, using the skills and wisdom that humanity has developed for generations to shape how we interact with new technologies that are developing faster than ever. To be traditional in the most modern possible way. Like the story of Indra's net, every change is reflected across all the places where our lives intersect. Even when we don't know the whole story, the impact of people's lives thread into our own. The untold stories still exist in this world. They are still woven into the fabric of our lives today, and they find their way through the science journals and the artists in this conversation that spans all the way to the moon and back. And now it's our turn to weave our thread into that conversation of what it means to be human, to weave the future that our children will inhabit by the way we do this work right now, in this technological moment. That is up to us. May we take it up with joy, a focus, and goodwill. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.